Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 2, Orientalist Discourse and Colonial Modernity, and our topic is Nationalism, History and Colonial Knowledge. So far we have talked about nationalism, assuming that there was one single entity called nationalism, and that was Indian nationalism. As it happens, there was neither a single nationalism nor, for that matter, a single Indian nationalism. We know, for example, that the Indian National Congress espoused one kind of Indian nationalism that we may call secular nationalism. We also know that the Muslim League espoused, at least from around 1940s onward, a Pakistani nationalism. This is often referred to as the two-nation theory. This was also propounded by someone like Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, who stood for an explicitly Hindu Indian nationalism. We also know, for instance, that there was during the nationalist period a Bengali nationalism, an Assamese nationalism, a Malayali nationalism, and such other nationalism. The question is that if there was an already existing object nation called India, how do we account for the fact that so many different people saw it in so many different ways? Sudipta Kaviraj answers this question in his well-known essay, The Imaginary Institution of India, by claiming that the Indian that we talk of so unproblematically today was not really a discovery. It was an invention. By calling it a discovery, as Nehru did in his discovery of India, we seem to imply that it was already there, presumably from time immemorial. If you are asked today to describe what India is, you will most probably point to its geographical boundaries, stretching from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and Bay of Bengal to Arabian Sea. You will recount the different linguistic, religious, caste, and tribal groups that inhabit this landmass. You will also probably say that because of all this, Indian represents a unity in diversity. And yet, what if you are told that before the 19th century nobody exactly knew the physical stretch of this landmass, and that our ancestors had no idea of how many communities and religions existed in this land, nor did they have any idea of how many people there were in each community? What then is the picture of India that you will draw? How did the early nationalists draw the picture of their India? Now let us move to the next point, construction of India in the 19th century. Take for instance the fact that the first tentative maps of India, the name for India too, did not exist at that time. were drawn up by James Rennell, a colonial official in Bengal between 1782 and 1788. It was only by 1818 that, with the East India Company annexation of large parts of the subcontinent, that an idea of the geographical stretch of the land began to emerge. It was only in the 19th century that the idea of the geographical identity called India was consolidated. As Matthew Adney detailed documentation and analysis of the mapping of India argues, in constructing a uniform and comprehensive archives of India, the British fixed the scope and character of the region's territories. They located and mapped the human landscape of villages, forts, roads, irrigation schemes, and boundaries within the physical landscape of hills, rivers, and forests. It was also in the 19th century that the first censuses of India were done, and only in 1881 that the first comprehensive census took place. It was then that the idea of the different communities that inhabited the land became available, as also their numbers. But this was not all. It was not simply that the British compiled information about the land in an objective manner. To count and make sense of a huge population of a land like the Indian subcontinent, they had to classify the population into different groups. As there were no clear cut notions of community, the British defined them in their own ways for purposes of classification. Large categories such as Hindu and Muslims, as well as those of caste, in which they fitted thousands of jatis, were, in a sense, colonial constructs devised primarily for the purpose of census numerations. It is not as though religious demonstrations and jatis did not exist before the censuses, but there were large zones of indefinable gray areas that were not easily amenable to classification. These hundreds of categories had to be reduced to a few easily handleable administrative categories. For that purpose, their boundaries had to be precisely defined. In doing so, colonial rule actually created new categories and fixed them in certain specific ways, as a lot of historical work now shows. This is not a matter that we can go into at any length here, but a few points should be noted. In his essay mentioned above, Kaviraj has made a distinction between what he calls fuzzy and enumerated communities. One of the ways in which the very act of numeration and classification transformed the way in which communities exist is captured by Kaviraj in this distinction. Individuals in pre-modern fuzzy communities did not have a fixed sense of identity, but that does not mean that they had no sense of identity. Individuals, he argues, could on appropriate occasions describe themselves as Vaishnavas, Bengalis, or maybe Rahis and Kshatriyas, villagers, and so on. But none of these would be a complete description of their identity. Each of these could very precisely define their conduct in specific situations, but it was radically different from the identity of modern enumerated communities in one way. It was only when one singular identity was fixed that they would begin to ask, as modern communities do, about how many there were in the world, what was their representation in public institutions, how were they being discriminated against, and so on. So, as Dipesh Chakravarti asserts, by the 1890s, Hindu and Muslim leaders were quoted census figures at each other to prove that whether or not they had received their legitimate share of benefits, such as employment and education, from British rule. In that sense, modern notions of majority and minority and such other questions become possible to pose only with the emergence of such enumerated communities. It is from this angle that the Gyanendra Pandey contends in his construction of communalism in colonial North India that even though there were sectarian conflicts among Hindus and Muslims before colonialism, they were usually local conflicts with many different roots. They were not communalism in the modern sense because there was no sense of a community in the first place. At any rate, he argues there was no sense of an all India Hindu or Muslim community before colonial practices and knowledge inscribed this difference as essential to Indian society. We can see, for instance, that the whole discourse about the Muslim population overtaking the Hindu population could only begin to take shape once the idea of a majority and minority was made possible through practices of numeration and classification. One of the major facts that emerges then from the discussion of colonial governmental practices is that our very idea of India, its geographical boundaries, its population, and its cultural composition, etc., are all formed by the knowledge produced by the colonial state. What is most important is that all subsequent politics, including nationalist politics, was shaped by this knowledge. In the initial phases of the nationalist movement, it was not really clear what nationalism was all about. There was a critique of colonial rule, to be sure, but then this critique was not being mounted on behalf of a clearly defined nation called India. As many studies have shown, there was often a Bengali nationalism or an Assamese nationalism and such others that were the first identifications of the anti colonial elites. As the idea of India became more entrenched and as its contours became more clearly defined, nationalism quickly appropriated this India as the ideal candidate for the new nation to be. The next point is nationalist imagination and Indian history. There was one problem, however: how could a so recent an entity claim to any kind of legitimacy as a nation? For the very idea of nationhood required that the new political community lay claim to an ancient history. For the large part of the 19th century, therefore, we see early nationalists vigorously at work to invent a history of India. As Kaviraj puts, in this period, particularly in Bengal, history breaks out everywhere. Important thinkers like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay proclaim we must have a history. Bankim, in fact, puts it more vehemently that even when they go hunting for birds' shapes, that is, Britishers write its history, but alas, Bengalis have no history. Notice that even at this stage, Bankim was only thinking of Bengal and Bengali as his nation. Nevertheless, the desire to have a history was already powerful. What does this search for history mean? Does it mean that Bengalis or Indians had no past? Certainly, that was not the case. But as in all pre modern cultures, the relationship to the past was of a different kind. What is it that made history in the modern sense different from the earlier accounts of the past? If we look at the accounts that are available in the pre colonial period, they are either accounts for genealogies of kings or they are orally transmitted stories of particular events. For there to be history, there had to be a community, an enumerated community, whose history it would be. There had to be a more concretely and rigidly defined sense of a community or a people whose history could then be written. This sense arose only when the idea of India became a tangible reality. Thanks to colonial government practices referred to above, much of the efforts of the nationalists of different hue was directed then at defining the political community such that it could incorporate all the diverse elements within the land called India. And this India had to have a history. Where did the resources for writing a history of India come? Now, the next point is Orientalism and the colonies' self knowledge. It is well known that academic knowledge about India, its history, was produced by the efforts of the great Orientalist scholars of the late 18th and 19th century. The founding of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784 by British Orientalists like William Jones can be considered as a milestone in this enterprise. O.P. Kejriwal's The Asiatic Society of Bengal and the Discovery of India's Past, for instance, documents the work of this pioneering institution in the excavation of India's past. You might be surprised to know that as Kejriwal was when he started looking at the work of the Asiatic Society, that till as late as 1834, the names of the ancient emperors like Samudragupta and Chandragupta Maurya were not known to anybody. He even mentioned with some excitement, I discovered that even Ashoka and Kanishka, not to mention their dynasties, were unknown names till the society's work brought them to light. He goes on to observe that it was astonishing for him to see that even the history of other well known dynasties like Palas and Senas, the Makraharis and Valbhas, and such other were unknown till the 19th century, when the Asiatic Society scholars brought them to light. This is not the place to dwell on the details of the voluminous work done by Orientalist scholars of the 19th century to unearth the history of India. What is important for us to note is that if right up to the 19th century, what we know today as the ancient nation of India did not have a clear geographical form, did not have an account of different cultures and communities that lived in it, did not have a history, then what was it that make possible the story that we know today, that India is an ancient nation which had an apparent golden age in the time of the Gupta and Maurya empires, and so on. The point being made here by scholars whom we have been discussing above is that India, like most other nations, is a relatively new and modern entity. Like other nations, it is the work of a collective imagination that was at work from the second half of the 19th century onwards, which deftly appropriated the work done by Orientalist scholars in order to produce the narrative of a great and ancient civilization. This was the nationalist imagination that retrospectively produced a history of the nation in which all the separate histories of the different entities that today form a part of the landmass called India became refigured as the history of India. So, when 19th century nationalists like Bankim Chandra proclaimed the need for history, they were actually proclaiming the need for a history of this modern rationalistic kind. This is why Kaviraj claims that the India was an object of invention and not a discovery. That is why there is something worth thinking about. For instance, in Kaviraj's claim that incorporating the history of the Satvanahas or of the Indus Valley civilization into a history of India involves a certain disgenerousness, or let us say, on the basis of present geographical boundaries, can we then lay claim to the Indus Valley civilization and Mohenjo-daro because they fall in present day Pakistan. In other words, how legitimate is the effort to claim all past history as parts of present day India's national history? Now, the fact is that we did not have a history before the 19th century should not be understood to mean that we did not have any sense or relationship with the past. Nationalists of the 19th and 20th century routinely saw this as a sign of our backwardness, of a lack that showed that we were not modern. Here, an important point should be kept in mind. One of the way in which post-structuralism has questioned the common sense of Western rationalism since the Enlightenment is by challenging its notion of human history as a singular and linear development. We know, for example, that the story of human history as a story of progress from lower to higher forms has been the basis of modern historical consciousness. Post structuralism has, among other things, challenged the idea that there can be only one way, the historical way of relating to the past. Again, this is not a question that we can go into in any detail here, but it is useful to bear in mind that such historical self consciousness is a characteristic of modern enumerated communities who need to continuously provide definitions of their collective selves to themselves and to others. If pre-modern communities did not need any rational account of their past, it was simply because their ways of being in the world did not require them to demonstrate who they are. The notion of time in such communities marks no clear separation between mythical time and lived time. One of the ways in which this understanding of history and historical time has affected lives in the colonies and continues to do so is that it institutes a particular historical journey for all societies as though they were a single entity. In that story, Europe appears as the place where history is because it is foremost in the scale of progress. All societies then became condemned to replay European history on their ground. One of the lessons of the body of work discussed above is that we have to begin writing our own histories not by rejecting Europe but by denying it and its history the universal status that it has acquired. Now we have reached to the summary of the unit. This unit is devoted to a thorough discussion of the concept of Orientalism and the question of modernity and its colonial roots in India. This is a comparatively new field of study and has thrown up new and revealing insights for both ex-colonies and their erstwhile colonies masters. For instance, the idea that history of Europe alone cannot be a reference point when writing histories of former colonies. The unit starts with the discussion of the different strands of scholarship on the subject. Four strands: Neo-Gandhian critique, subaltern studies school, US-based anthropological studies, and Edward Said's Orientalism have been examined. One next move on to an examination of the question of nationalism and colonial modernity. Here it has been explained as to how the way nationalism evolved in the former colonies was different from its evolution in Europe. It was nationalism with a difference. The last section of the unit examines how the idea of India as we know it today was conceptualized and developed by a nationalist historian of the colonial India. Here we want to wind up this lecture and we have come to the end of the unit. Thank you so much for your attention.